the Phil Mikan Show, and here we are today. It looks like another great day. Ha, 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 ha. That's for Barry. Erich Pratt is the Director of Communications, and we'll find out in a minute exactly what he is title-wise, but he has been brought up by his father, Larry Pratt, to understand the Second Amendment, and he works with him at the Gun Owners of America. He's very bright and knows his stuff. How are you this morning?
Doing real well, Phil. Thanks for having me on with you.
Well, we talked with your father yesterday, really in generic terms, about the history of this. People say when a country has a love affair with firearms or a fetish for firearms, and this country is pretty unique in that it basically was able to extricate itself as a result of the population being armed at a time when it had to be for self-protection, when the mother country couldn't provide a lot of protection. So they became pretty independent about protecting themselves and regulating themselves, and that carried over, and as a result, the English lost the crown jewel of their colonies. And that kind of gun protection right was guaranteed in the Constitution by basically saying we are able to protect ourselves, and that's an unalienable right. One of the things that we're seeing, there are some, and this is one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. I think you have the background. The contradictions the political powers are setting up, that they seem to want to impose more and more restrictions, regulations, laws, hurdles and hoops that we have to go through to maintain that right, because we are all becoming pretty stupid, and American people don't have the understanding. The responsibility is not able to be met by our common citizen, and that's not true. Your father and I agreed that if an American decides he's going to have a gun in his house, or if he's going to carry a firearm, if he gets the permit, he will know how to use the gun, and pray he doesn't have to. So, but here's a comment that I'm taking out of this is a quote. There's a gentleman that was talking in an interview, and basically he said, you have to know that there's a real contradiction in America's society. He said, he pointed out that the Americans are advised to not judge all Muslims by the actions of a few lunatics, but we are encouraged to judge all gun owners by the actions of a few lunatics. And that's where we lie as a country. It's like, don't do as I do, but do what I say. Do you understand what I just quoted you, Erich?
Well, I do, and I do think there is a double standard there, obviously. I agree with the sentiment that we should not judge an entire group by a few bad apples. I mean, that's certainly the case. At the same time, I think we need to understand that there is an ideology that is driving this. But having said that, no, you don't tarnish an entire group. But I think the reason there is this double standard is probably best put in the movie American Sniper, that dealt with the life of Chris Kyle. And, he talked about how, in fact, I think if I remember the movie right, it was his father telling him how, in this world there's three types of people: the sheep, the wolves, and the sheepdogs. And, the wolves want to attack the sheep, but the sheep don't know what to do in the face of aggression, and they will actually resent the sheepdogs. And you saw this when the movie came out. You have people like Michael Moore attacking Chris Kyle, saying he was a coward. I mean, Chris Kyle had dedicated his life to be the quote-unquote sheepdog. He wanted to be a protector, and the sheep resent that. You had actors coming out comparing Chris Kyle to Nazis. It's almost like a type of Stockholm syndrome, where these people would rather appease the real bad guys and give them a pass, and instead what they end up doing, as the quote points out, is they attack the protectors, those who are gun owners, who are, by and large, a law-abiding population. and yet we're the ones that get the brunt, and you have the administration trying to disarm law-abiding gunners. It's interesting, just recently the ATF came out with a report that in a 4-year period from 2010 to 2013, the stock of guns in this country doubled. And yet at the same time, now the ATF report didn't point this out, but at the same time during that 4-year period, the murder rate dropped. So what do we see? We really see that we have, as John Lott likes to say with his very famous book, we have more guns, less crime. So it's absolutely fallacious what the president and his administration are doing in launching their attacks against the gun.
Well, but it's not just the president. The president is obviously the catalyst, or seems to be, and he's liberal. I mean, he's a flaming liberal. We can see that.
Yes.
But the media, what you're seeing in with the media, is the fact that protection is. They make it sound like protecting yourself is a criminal act. How many times can you say you saw that police officer shooting that man running away from him on television? How many times? It had to be on every break. It had to be in every cable setup. And what the guy did was really onerous. I mean, it was unbelievable. Here he stopped somebody because he had a broken headlight or taillight or something, or the registration wasn't right, and the guy ran, because he didn't want to. He had a failure to appear in court or something. He didn't want to be arrested because he had some problems. But to shoot him 8 times, I mean, come on. Now, anybody that has any familiarity with firearms knows that was bad, and nobody is sitting there saying, as a gun advocate or as a person having a permit to carry a firearm, that's what should have happened. And if anybody, they'd be the first to sit there and say, what are you, crazy? Go find them later on. But the media played that as an example of not just police brutality, but the act itself was very evocative of what's wrong with guns.
Yes, they did. You're absolutely right. And yet, while the media does have a powerful role, they no longer, as you know, have the stranglehold that they used to. I mean, you remember how it was in the 70s and the 80s. I mean, there was no internet. There was no alternative media. There were no talk shows like yours, Phil. Talk shows like yours, the internet, the ability to get information in other places, our Facebook page relentlessly posting examples of self-defense cases. All these types of things have made a difference. And I would say in this area, in terms of educating the public on gun rights, we are actually winning. And I know a lot of folks are dispirited. They don't like the direction that the country's going, and I agree with that in many, many ways personally. But I will tell you, in this area of gun rights, you go back to 1990 when I think it was Gallup started asking the question. Actually, it was Gallup asking the question about do you favor gun rights or support more gun control? You only had 22% of the American people that were saying they didn't want more gun control. Well, as of the most recent survey, we now have a majority saying they oppose more gun control. You have Rasmussen saying that 7 in 10 people feel safer in an armed neighborhood. Another Gallup poll say 63% say that having a gun makes your home safer. So despite what the media, the mainstream media, is trying to do, and you're absolutely nailing the problem, they're not winning. At least not in this area, in terms of demonizing firearms, because people don't feel safe, and they want to feel safe. And they're realizing more and more that having a firearm to protect yourself is a way to feel safe. And, this idea of we're going to create gun-free zones so that we feel safe, it doesn't work. And increasingly, we're seeing example after example where it doesn't work. You know, the Tennessee shooting, the Fort Hood shooting, the Navy Yard shooting, the Charleston church shooting, just on and on and on. We see that just putting a sign up in front of a building and saying, hey, you can't take a gun in here. Well, guess what? Killers disregard those dumb signs.
And the thing that you're also very aware of is the more difficult you make it to buy a gun, the more difficult you make it to buy the ammunition for the gun. And there are questions that a lot of people have is like, why does the post office need 42 million rounds of 9mm handgun? You know, why? What are they doing? And each agency, you know, the stranglehold the government has tried to impose on the users of firearms in this country, they can't make guns illegal. All they can do is turn them into hammers. And that seems to be one of the tactics that they're using. The disarming of the population, when a government looks like it really wants to disarm the population and it's a concerted effort and an agenda on a faction of the government, it's very disconcerting for a population that's always had the basic clarion call that they have the right to protect themselves. And we're thinking against criminals or intruders. Most people would not step to the plate and think their government was something they had to worry about. But it's becoming a fact. More and more people are saying, wait a minute, what are you guys doing? I do think that's the case.
Certainly, and I do. You know, you mentioned that the failure of gun control, and I think that's becoming all the more clear. And it's a dangerous combination when you have the government arming itself more and more, becoming the standing army that our founding fathers feared. At the same time, they're trying to disarm the public. And one of the ways they've tried to do that is through background checks. You know, 95% of initial denials under the background check are false positives, or people with the same names, people that shouldn't be denied. The background checks being used to deny many law-abiding military veterans who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that. Now they're trying to expand that to cover seniors. We're talking millions of seniors. You know, people.
Yeah, and the criteria they're looking for the seniors. They're saying, number one, they're checking Social Security records. I mean, it's like all your worst nightmare. They're checking Social Security members, and they're wanting to see if the guy's paying his own bill. Does he have a checking account? I said, wait a minute, hold it. It's like you got to be kidding me.
And this is pernicious. And
yes, it is.
Those who supported background checks as a way, we need to keep guns out of the wrong hands. I see more and more people finally saying, you know what, maybe that wasn't a good idea because it's not stopping those people from getting guns. I mean, look, let's just run down the recent list. The Tennessee shooter submitted to the background check in buying guns. The Chattanooga church shooter got his gun through a background check. Both Fort Hood shooters passed FBI background checks. The Aurora Theater shooter, the Navy Yard shooter, the Santa Barbara shooter. I mean, you just go on down the line, shooter after shooter. They got their guns through the background check. And then you've got a whole host of other killers that didn't go through the background check, like the Sandy Hook shooter. He killed his first victim and stole her weapons.
That was called his mother.
His mother. What about the illegal alien recently? The gun that he used to kill that poor girl in San Francisco, that was originally owned by a federal officer. So either he stole it or somebody else stole it, but in other words, it was a stolen gun. He didn't go through a background check to get it. And so while it's not stopping killers from getting guns, what do we see? Well, the background checks being used to stop military veterans. Now, soon, coming to a home near you to stop senior citizens from buying firearms. And just on and on and on, we see this list growing where it's just affecting us, the good people, and not the bad guys that it was intended to. And it really, Phil, I think it goes back to the whole notion of God-given rights. It was a mistake in the first place to put government in the position of trying to screen law-abiding citizens to determine who can exercise their rights. You always run the very potential of horrendous abuse when you put government in that position.
Well, it's like a law is passed where you can no longer have a 15-round magazine. And I've heard of cases where somebody was a gun collector, and this is in Connecticut, and he turned in and registered 29 of his 15-round magazines for, like Beretta. They were all 15 rounds, 15-round Beretta, 15-round SIG, whatever it was. And he did not turn in 10. Either he forgot them, they were in another room, didn't think about it, whatever, or he was going to, and he didn't even take the date passed like that. And something came up where he was, he had a protective order issued against him because he and his wife got into a fight. They asked him if he had any firearms. He said yes. They said, okay, we have to confiscate him because the protective order, you're not allowed to have firearms. I'm saying, okay. And then they go in, and then they charge him for each magazine he had illegally, and all of a sudden this guy's looking at some really serious time, and it's kind of a gotcha. The laws that they put in place is a gotcha, and you sit there and say, whoa, what is that about? But
absolutely, and yet those very laws that you were just referencing, those registration laws, how do they stop that
they don't.
Guys like that San Francisco illegal?
Yeah, they don't. They don't stop any of the guys that you just enumerated. They don't stop the church guy. He got his gun illegally. He did. They don't. It's a control, and it's a reaction of the state government. That's state law. It's a reaction of the state government to a calamity, an awful event that happened here. And it was a number of things happened. It was to show the public that this was really bad. It was kind of a Band-Aid to make the public feel like something was being done to prevent this again. And it was a reaction of lawmakers saying, we've got to do something. I mean, this is just awful. And so they disregarded basic rights to make good on something that was awful. Now, when you disregard a basic right, and when you disregard, that's the beginning. That's the beginning of the decline. That's the beginning of the fall of Rome.
Well, it is, and when you disregard people's rights, either by denying them or putting their rights on hold, there will be travesties. And we saw that recently in New Jersey. And New Jersey is another state that has very strict gun control laws. You just can't go into a store and buy a gun. And here this gal was being harassed by her ex-boyfriend, so she wanted to buy a gun to protect herself, like many people would in that situation. Well, it takes weeks to months in New Jersey to be able to get the permit to purchase in that state, and during that waiting period, she was murdered right outside of her home by her ex-boyfriend. Now, in many similar cases, that boyfriend ends up dead, and I can name cases like that where women went and who were being harassed went and bought a gun. Thankfully, they didn't have to wait for it, and sadly, but thankfully, they were able to use it in self-defense. This woman was denied by the laws of her state. And in a very real sense, they share some of the blame. They have some of the blood on their hands for putting her rights on hold the way they did.
Yeah, try and sell that one. I want to see that kettle of fish. So let me do a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of attitude that we're facing now in terms of America with the left and the right and what's happening. This is the Phil Mikan Show. I'm talking with Erich Pratt from the Gun Owners of America. We'll be right back. We're back. This is the Phil Mikan Show. I'm talking with Erich Pratt. He is the brighter and more knowledgeable of the Pratt boys. His father has told me this, and I agree. I believe it's so. One of the things I mentioned when I was talking with your father yesterday, and it's a quote from a book that basically I've been reading. There's a Lieutenant Colonel Alan West was quoted. He's got his own website, and he's been in the military and he's done whatever. But in a book written by Jim Mars, Population Control, he quotes West, and West talks about conundrums and things that the American people are going in. But one of the things he says, and I'll read through three of them, and I think part of this and the agenda of the controlling administration right now is to control or disarm the population or restrict the use and make the population forget about firearms as an alternative. I think that's as much as the strategy as it is to disarm them. Just make them feel that it's not a possible alternative. It's like living in New Jersey and you got to wait months. And if you do go through the flips and flops and the hoops that they put up, you will eventually get a gun. The problem is, while you're waiting for that process, don't need one, because it's going to take time. And that's really the example, this young woman that you were talking about in the last segment. Basically, she ran out of time because they were sitting there, and it was something, government seems to do that now with more ease, where they sit there and make you not able to get something quickly. They put in roadblocks, so you have to go around back and forth, so on and so forth. In any event, Alan West goes, and he says there are 6 conundrums that we have to go through. I won't go with that. But West also, he went on to note another contradiction in American society. He pointed out that Americans are advised to not judge all Muslims by the actions of a few lunatics, but we are encouraged to judge all gun owners by the actions of a few lunatics. And that he's right on there as far as I can say.
Yeah, you pointed out that, along with that quote, that the war is against gun owners, to demonize gun owners. You might remember Erich Holder's statement back when, before he was Attorney General, back in the 90s, in the Clinton administration, talking about, and this is on videotapes, people can YouTube this, talking about how we need to brainwash the next generation.
I see that. I see that they're doing that. So, and they've done that every generation.
Yes.
There's been other things. There's another thing that he says. I've got 2 more groupings that he has. He said, it seems we constantly hear about how Social Security is going to run out of money. How can we never hear about welfare or food stamps running out of money? What's interesting is the first group worked for their money, but the second group not necessarily did. And then another thing that he says, and this is something that really is kind of unforgivable. West finally says, a veteran of the conflict in Iraq pondered, why are we cutting benefits for our veterans, no pay raises for our military, and cutting our army to a level lower than before World War II, but we're not stopping the payments or benefits of illegal aliens? Now, I don't know if that's true or not in terms of the way it's presented, but we do hear that amnesty is something that's going to happen, and that I think that's why Donald Trump is making traction with his ferocity of fighting back. But what we're seeing is the contradictions that we are people are becoming savvy to them. They say, wait a minute, what's going on? What are you guys doing? It's finally starting to resonate with the general population and even the younger people are saying, wait a minute, I'm next in line. What are you guys doing? And what we're looking at, it's scary. They are disarming the army and taking the military down. They fired a lot of generals. A lot of guys, career officers, were let go because they weren't in compliance or towing the line. But a scary thing that we witnessed in Boston in 2013 is they've militarized the police departments. Has anybody talked to you about that? Anybody said anything about that?
Well, that's certainly a concern. Here we are seeing nationally our murder rates dropping, and they have been over the last 20 years. If anything, there is less of an argument for needing to militarize police forces. Although, talk about conundrums, what's interesting is that the way the mainstream media presents the news, and you've, been talking about this, how they show certain clips over and over again, even as our murder rates have been falling in this country, when the American people are polled, they actually believe the opposite. They believe that murder and crime is on the way up, even though they've actually been falling steadily for years, even as more and more guns are being made, manufactured, and sold in this country. Again, we see more guns, less crime, yet that's not the way the American public perceives it, and this has a lot to do with the way the media presents it. And so as a result, I see that backfiring in certain senses. As much as they ran stories on Ferguson and Baltimore, now the recent Chattanooga shooting, in each case, you see that when these types of situations occur, gun sales rocketed. It was about a year ago that you had the riots in Ferguson. Earlier this year, you had the riots in Baltimore. And in both cases, we see people running to gun stores trying to buy firearms. And now we see this in Chattanooga. What gun dealers say would normally be a very quiet summer, they're seeing gun sales spike. And so, that's what we tend to see, that whenever the media gives this type of attention to evil, people want to feel safe, and they don't feel safe when they see that, there's all these pockets of gun-free zones, and that's why now we're even seeing a tremendous push on Capitol Hill to start finally dismantling these gun-free zones, and they're going to start with the gun ban on military bases. So you've got, by my count, 5 legislators that have already introduced bills in the Congress to repeal what is really a ban that makes no sense. I mean, here are guys who are trained to use firearms, and then we tell them, but you can't use them to protect yourself. How much sense does that make?
None. But again, there are people that think firearms are innately wrong, and I used to say for years, I would say, if I had to have a gun in my nightstand, I would leave that town. I would move. There's something wrong with the town. And through the years, I've learned differently by different projects that I've done and things like that. One of the points one of the reasons I called, and I did call you guys, was there was a program, a statistical program that I read about and listened to, and what was being said was like somebody was making up a reality in La La Land. And basically, it was a police officer who was a consultant. He was a police officer in the command structure of a police department, and he'd done statistical bases and this and that. And what he came back with is, I'm sitting there saying, and basically he said that anybody that had the carry permit and got into a altercation, let's say you were at a bank and somebody was robbing the bank and you decided to stop, or you were in the mall and you decided to stop somebody that was shooting, or where gun owners of America say, the only thing that's going to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And basically he was saying statistically 100% of the people who have the right to carry and introduce themselves into a conflict and a spontaneous situation lose. They either are killed or wounded, or they lose. Have you heard anything like that? Is this guy making something up, or am I smoking dope?
It is absolutely ludicrous what he is saying, and it's a bald-faced lie. A year ago this month, we saw in Darby, Pennsylvania, a guy who was prohibited, by the way, wasn't allowed to own guns, but yet, as we often see, they easily get their hands on guns, walked into a hospital in Darby, Pennsylvania, and he was going to shoot his doctor, kill his doctor. Police also said he had enough ammo on him. He was going to walk up and down the halls shooting people. Thankfully, by the way, this hospital was a gun-free zone. Didn't seem to deter the killer. But thankfully, that doctor was himself defying the gun-free zone because he had a concealed carry permit and he had his gun with him. He shot and immobilized the killer, saving, potentially scores of lives up and down that hall. Well, that was a year ago this month. Then, last month in Ohio, a guy who's denied entry into a bar goes home angry, comes back with a shotgun, starts firing in the bar. Thankfully, wasn't able to kill anybody yet, but behind the bar was a bartender with a concealed carry permit. He shoots and kills the guy, ends the threat. We've seen this played out even in Chicago. There was an Uber driver earlier this year.
Yeah, the Uber driver is interesting because he basically was just dropping somebody off, and he kind of drives into this mayhem scene. The thing that this gentleman was saying, and it's a point that he was very good. He was very good in his statistical base, and again, the questions were asked by a Barry-like person who were obviously very negative firearms, and so they basically were giving him leading questions and not saying, well, wait a minute, what about this or what about that? But what you were seeing was that he said the main thing you have to think about in a concealed carry fight for life scenario is, are you going to be able to take your gun that you've been carrying for years and years and training on the range for years and years, and you're going to confront somebody in front of you? Are you going to be able to kill somebody? Are you able to go and actually take and discharge a weapon knowing that this person will go down, even if they're threatening your life? Are you going to be able to do that? And then he said that's one of the first things that we ask for applicants that go into the police department. Are you going to be able to kill somebody? And you think about it, and that's pretty good. That's a pretty good question. And when you think about it, if you're walking around in a mall and somebody is shooting somebody, are you going to be able to whip out your Glock or your Beretta 92 and let go?
Well, in answer to what he's saying, first of all, I would say it happens all the time among the American population, and we were just talking about some examples. But he also builds a straw man because he assumes that the only legitimate self-defense is where the bad guy ends up dead.
Right.
And I would
that was really the false point. I thought you picked it up immediately, but just showing a gun in many instances will stop it.
Actually, statistically, in about 90% of the cases, that's all you have to do. And quite frankly, if that scares somebody away from my home so that nobody in my home is raped or in any way assaulted, I would consider that a legitimate self-defense case.
Yeah, amen.
It's one thing if the guy is will not relent and is going to attack, and then you're going to have to, people do it all the time. They shoot and they kill or wound, but I'm just as happy if the person leaves and never comes back. So, yeah, he's really built a straw man here. As they say, you build a straw man, it's easy to tear it down. It's really ludicrous what this guy is saying. And I would say this, he is grossly out of step with the average police officer. 90% of police officers actually support the right of concealed carry by American civilians, and almost 90% say that the way that you stop and prevent these mass shootings from occurring is by allowing civilians to carry and defend themselves. So he's probably one of these paid spokesmen, and I wouldn't give much credence to what he has to say.
Well, but there are a lot of people that think that, and what he's saying, and I'm going to go to break now, but what people have to understand is when you're going to a firing range to practice and to become proficient with a firearm, if you're going to carry it, you better know how to use it. And if you're going to know how to use it, you've got to go to a firing range and you've got to train. And you've got to train. It's like saying you're going to play the piano and never sit down to play it, and all you can do is a scale. So shooting a target isn't the beginning of it. A lot of people that carry guns go into a tactical scenario. They'll go into a special program, which is, they have classes all over the country where you sit there and you kind of get your mindset to what you're going to have to do. I'm not saying everybody does that, but that's available. You'll spend money to train yourself for that moment.
That is important. I'm not going to, in any way downgrade what you're saying, Phil. However, I would say there is a difference between home self-defense and actually being a police officer where you have to insert yourself into dangerous situations.
Right.
Most self-defense situations occur where the attacker is 7 feet away, and it's not hard to know who's the attacker, who's the bad guy. I mean, I've actually heard of many cases, and I don't necessarily encourage this, but many cases where a guy buys a gun, sticks it under his bed, never takes it to the range, doesn't even take it out of the box, but yet when somebody is in their home with a hammer and attacking them, they pull out the gun and without having had any training, shoot the guy within 7 to 10 feet. That's actually not that hard to do.
Yeah, it's called conversational. That's a conversational range. Let me do a break. This is the Phil Mikan Show. We're talking with Erich Pratt from Gun Owners of America. We'll be right back. Mr. Phil Mikan Show. We are talking the right to carry firearms today, and we're talking the training. Erich, as Gun Owners of America, what do you guys recommend? I mean, I know you're advocates for the Second Amendment, and you're ferocious about trying to protect the Second Amendment from laws, and you lobby down in Washington and kind of keep the Congress representatives and senators on their toes. But what do you recommend for training? Do you sit there and tell people just bring the gun home? Do you have a 10-point program that gun owners should do, or is that their problem?
Well, we certainly would encourage that, and we would encourage people just to check in their local area. I mean, there's going to be, except in the rarest of occasions, if you live in New York City, and who knows, maybe even there, you are going to find within a reasonable drive places where you can get trained, you can take a class, and that's certainly going to be invaluable. Obviously at Gun Owners of America, our main mission is lobbying. I know some of the other groups do a lot with the shooting sports and self-defense, and they certify trainers and things like that. And they do such a good job of it, it's not really something that we need to duplicate. The reason that Gun Owners of America was actually started, we were actually started by a former NRA board member that wanted a more aggressive lobbying approach, and that has been our approach since the beginning. We are no compromise. We will not support things that infringe upon our God-given right of self-defense, and for that reason we've actually taken different positions than other gun groups in years past. For example, we did not support the background check, now 20 some years later, we're seeing the problems with it, how legitimate people are being denied. But even fundamentally, we knew that this was an infringement. The Second Amendment says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And telling somebody, well, you're going to have to pass a background check before you can exercise a God-given right, that would be about as heinous as doing it to you as a radio broadcaster or a journalist, violating your First Amendment rights, or, screening pastors before they give sermons, or screening husbands before they get married to make sure they're not going to be a wife abuser, on and on and on. If you have a God-given right to do something, it's no business of government to screen you, to put a prior restraint ahead of time. Now, if you, abuse that right, well, then you forfeit your rights. And there's always been that doctrine of forfeiture of rights in this country. But, sadly, that's been confused. And instead of forfeiting rights after a crime is committed, now we're going down the road of that movie Minority Report with Tom Cruise, where, we're going to try to divine who are the people that are going to commit crimes in the future. And that leads to tremendous abuse, like that woman in New Jersey that we were just talking about, who, they spend weeks screening her, and then when she really needs a gun, she's killed by her ex-boyfriend who had been assaulting her. It was the very reason she wanted a gun for protection.
The proponents of gun control, if not gun denial, basically are saying that, we as a country, the population is too big now. When the Second Amendment was written, the country was 95% rural farming. They needed firearms to, shoot foxes and bears and things like that. And we really, as a society, don't need it. There was a statistic that I'd used with your father that I thought was pretty interesting, and that the United States is probably the world's biggest civilian owner of guns, private guns. And we have 5% of the population, and we have between 35 and 50% of all the privately held firearms in the world, which I think is a pretty startling figure. And then, do you have any idea who the number 2 and number 3 countries are that have private citizens ownership and say it's okay?
Not offhand, no. But I do agree with you. I know we are the most heavily armed nation in the world, yet what people don't often like to acknowledge is that we're not even in the top 100 for the highest murder rates. We are not even in the top 100. So you've got gun control, super gun control countries with much higher murder rates than us, like, Honduras, Mexico, Russia, South Africa. So nobody wants to talk about that. Certainly not the liberals. The anti-gun liberals don't want to talk about that. But yeah, we are the most heavily armed, and yet we have a relatively low murder rate. And if you were to take out places like Chicago and Washington, D.C. In other words, take out the places where
the major metropolitan areas.
Well, but not just that. It's not even just that, Phil. It's places where gun rights are infringed and denied, and where it's very difficult for people to own guns, because it's not so much metropolitan. For example, El Paso, Texas, is the largest. For years running now, they have won the safest big city award. And
that's because everybody carries a gun.
Exactly. That's exactly the point. So if you take out the gun control meccas, if you will, we actually have, murder rates that are comparable to much of Europe. So it's really the dangerous places that we've turned into, where we've adopted third world gun control policies, is what really drives up the gun control or the murder rates in this country.
What is interesting is Switzerland and Finland. I believe the populations in both of those countries go under arms as what we would call a militia, or National Guard is what it's called now, and they have their firearms in their homes.
Yeah,
they'll keep their Uzis and submachine guns. They've done some changing to that recently in some countries, but the Israelis also, the armed forces in Israel carry their firearms home with them. They've been doing that for years. I don't know if they're still doing it, but I know that was one of the unique things about them. The thing that you look at with this country and the general population of the world, you're seeing 5% of the population owning 35 to 50% of the private firearms. Well, that also is one of the reasons the ownership of firearms is ingrained in the population. It's like apple pie and motherhood. I mean, you sit there, and I'm not minimizing it or making it sound like it's no big deal. It's a very big deal. But in each and every country that has been disarmed, Germany was disarmed. People don't realize why all of a sudden, you look at England and Great Britain, they were disarmed, and they were disarmed by Oliver Cromwell. They were disarmed because the government didn't want to be threatened. The Civil War that happened in the 1600s, 1649, 1648, whenever it was, with the Roundheads and the Royalists, basically Oliver Cromwell came to power and he disarmed the yeomen. He basically said you can't own guns anymore, and he's the first one who had the English put together a standing army. And now we're seeing that this particular administration, rather than expanding and fortifying the military, is kind of making it dissolve and coming up with a militarized police force. That gets scary.
Yeah, James Madison, who's considered the father of the Constitution, said that the Constitution preserves the right to keep and bear arms, but that, the tyrannies in Europe, they're afraid to trust the people with arms because they would be speedily overturned. And that's true. Tyrannies, tyrants, potentates, they don't like the people owning firearms. And the difference in this country, and this gets back to what you were talking about earlier, people saying, well, maybe we had the right during the days of the founding, but not today. It's not understanding the proper view of rights. And our founders did, and they stated this in the Declaration, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. An inalienable right is not a word we often use, but it means it can't be taken away. It can't be infringed or limited in any way. And unless you've committed a crime where you forfeit your right, government has no business taking away any of these rights because they were given to us by a higher source than the government or a piece of paper. It's fallacious to think that the reason we have the right to keep and bear arms is because it's in the Second Amendment. That's not the reason we have.
No, that's called the guarantee.
Exactly. It was a guarantee. In fact, even the way they wrote it, they didn't say the people shall have the right to keep and bear arms. It was the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. They were assuming it already existed because, as they had said in the Declaration, we have rights from God. They assumed it existed, and as you said, it was now a guarantee. It was protecting us from the government ever taking away that right. So, the people that are saying, well, we no longer have this right today, they have a totally fallacious view of where our rights come from, and that's probably a bigger problem. That's why we see, we're told now that we have all kinds of new rights that are just being invented out of thin air, which usually means, hang on to your wallet, Phil, because when somebody has a right to this or that means you're going to have to pay for it. But notice, the rights that we have, in our Declaration and in our Constitution, these are rights that you might say that, they're negative in nature. In other words, they're protections against government doing something to us. They can't take our life. They can't take our property. They can't take our guns or our freedom of speech, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, does anybody want to talk about the Rocco Act? I believe that's what they call it, where if you just have drugs in the house and you don't know your son is downstairs, loading bags of pot and selling it on the street, you lose the house and the money goes to the police department or to the FBI or whatever. I mean, somebody's got to explain that to me, and that's been happening for 30, 40 years. And an absolute breach of the Bill of Rights. And nobody has really fought it because everybody is getting a piece of that action in some context, and it's scary. Because everybody just kind of goes deaf, dumb, and stupid when they do it. And, you sit there and look at it and say, when did the rights go away? When did it change? When does it no longer count? And these are questions that we're asking now. But when Boston happened, when they had that awful event during their marathon, and you had two, count them, two young men, one was 19, one was 25, whatever, held the city of Boston hostage. Shut it down. People would not leave their neighborhoods. This is the place that got the military of Britain, when it was at its height, to hightail it away from Lexington and Concord. Their forefathers were the ones who basically said, no, we're not going to do that. And when this event happened, instead of people saying, okay, where are they, or see if you can find them, they were ordered into their house like sheep, and they went. And then we watched. We didn't have the military come in. We didn't have the National Guard come in, but we had guys that looked like them and acted like them. They busted doors down. They knocked on doors, went in uninvited. Where did that come from?
If there's a silver lining to that, it's incidents like that, and the one similar in New York where you had the escaped prisoners for 2-3 weeks, where people realize the police and the National Guard, they can't be there to protect me. They usually arrive after the fact. And we saw stories like in New York. I remember seeing one woman talking to the media saying, I've hated guns all my life. I hated the fact that, my husband was into them. And now with these escaped prisoners on the loose, we've got guns on every table in the house, and I'm ready to shoot. Her anti-gun stance was flipped in a heartbeat when she finally realized that she wasn't able to she wouldn't be able to protect herself, and the police weren't going to be able to protect them. I don't know if my father has told you, but that's actually what got him to own his first gun way back in the 1960s, was hearing a police officer on the radio during the 68 riots saying, we don't think we're going to be able to contain the rioters if they go out into the suburbs. And he thought, I need to be able to protect my family. Right. And that's how a lot of people come to love the Second Amendment is, when push comes to shove, they realize, you know what, here I've been putting all my trust in some external third party to protect me, and now they're telling me that they can't protect me. I've got to take matters into my own hands because I want to feel safe.
Erich Pratt, I want to thank you for being with us. As always, the Pratt boys do a good job.